Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying Elden Ring. Those of you on the PC version may have noticed poorer frame rates than you were expecting, and the settings leave a lot to be desired for a PC game. That said, I've tweaked my settings a bit, and that has helped me squeeze a bit more FPS out of my game, so I thought I would explain to you what impact each setting has on the game's visuals and performance. Overall, at least at the time of this video, Elden Ring is not particularly well optimized, and the PC version suffers from being another bad console port. The frame rate has been capped at 60 FPS, the setting options are pretty bleak, and the controls are egregiously bad, with certain control options impossible to respec, all but forcing you to play with a controller as a result. Then there are the horrific stutters that have dropped my frame rate down to like 15 frames per second, and I suspect it has to do with when and where it chooses to load things in this open world game. If you run into an area with these microstutters right now, there's not a setting you can change to get rid of it or really even improve upon it. Even with everything on maximum, my FPS would dip to around 15 in these areas, and with everything on low or off, it would dip to like 17. That's such a minor improvement that it's barely even worth mentioning. The best thing you can do when you experience these stutters are to just leave the area as fast as possible. Lingering, especially running around back and forth as you might if you get caught fighting something, will cause the stutters to happen over and over and over again. So just leave the area, try to get the enemies to follow you if you're trying to fight them, and hope they patch this problem out sooner rather than later. As for the graphic settings themselves, I have personally found that the difference between setting everything to low and everything to max results in only a very small difference in performance, but a huge difference in visuals. Obviously, being an open world game, the difference in performance is going to vary considerably based on how much of the world you can see in any given moment, how many bad guys are on the screen, whether any crazy effects are going off, and so on. So if you're standing on a mountaintop looking at the entire world, you're going to get much worse performance than you will be standing in a cramped, empty dungeon. This should go without saying. For me, I'm running this at 1440p on an i7-8700K and with an AMD Radeon RX 6900 XT and 32 gigs of RAM. If I'm running at max settings, most of the time I'm hovering in the 55 to 60 FPS range, but if I'm looking out at a huge portion of the world, it will start to dip to around 48 to 52 FPS. This is certainly not good, but in these same areas with everything turned down to low or off, my FPS will only rise to about 54 to 58 FPS, a difference of around 6 frames per second between max and low. If your experience is anything like mine, this is so low of a difference that it's almost not even worth worrying about. That said, in a game where timing is everything and the game is already chugging at 60 FPS by PC standards, every frame counts sometimes. Therefore, in this settings guide, I'm going to teach you how much of an impact each setting has on both visuals and performance so that you can pick what's right for you based on your taste and performance. You might be surprised just how little some of these settings have on the visuals, at least in terms of what's noticeable. I've heard some people say you should run this game in full screen mode, and that's generally what I would recommend too, but if I'm being honest, I've noticed no real performance difference between that and borderless window mode. Some people report screen tearing in borderless window mode, but I haven't had that experience personally. Also, as a streamer on a 2PC setup, I've actually noticed the inverse. I get screen tearing on my streaming PC if I'm running this game in full screen mode. It doesn't show up on my gaming screen, but it gets output to the stream that way. Borderless window mode fixes it totally, which is why I am running it in that mode. I realize this probably doesn't apply to most people, but it's starting to feel like everyone streams these days anyway, so I figured I would mention it. If you are a streamer and you want another trick to avoid screen tearing, I made another video about this a few years ago. I've linked to it here for you to check out. Okay, let's talk about the settings. Now, keep in mind that because this game is capped at 60 FPS, and in my experience, the difference between everything on max and everything on low is only about 6 FPS, and there's 14 settings here. Most of these settings are going to have almost no noticeable difference on the game's performance individually, although a few do. Therefore, I'm looking at this as Let's point out the settings that seem to have the biggest impact on performance and maybe sacrifice those as long as they don't make the game look ugly. And let's point out the settings that have the biggest impact on visuals and keep those as high as possible unless they significantly affect performance. Your taste may vary, so feel free to tweak to your preferences. What I'm showing you are mine. Texture quality in most games has a massive impact on how good the game looks, but in this game it has very little noticeable impact unless you're really paying attention and focusing on tiny little details. Even at long distances, characters look about the same, the environments look about the same. Sometimes if you're standing in a hallway, the walls get a little blurry on low in the distance, but otherwise you're probably not going to notice much of a difference here. I seem to get an extra frame by not having this on maximum, but there was no noticeable difference between low, medium, and high in terms of performance, so I've put it on high. Anti-aliasing quality has a big impact on visuals. Hair on the back of your head and grass around you and in the distance looks a lot more pixelated when it's turned off, and even on low, things still look super unnatural, especially the grass. I found this not only to be unsightly, but also slightly distracting as it made things harder to spot or get my attention when there's all this high contrast white and dark pixels waving around. Because the game not only looks better, but actually makes spotting things easier, the tiny dip in FPS is worth it to me, and so I would recommend leaving this on high. SSAO has a massive effect on how the environment looks. Shadows look significantly better and add a lot of depth to the scenery, but there's about a 2 to 4 FPS difference between having this turned to max or having this turned off. Visually, there's not that much difference between max and high, but you do cut the performance dip in half by about 1 to 2 FPS, so that seems worthwhile. If you go to medium or lower, it really starts impacting visuals, making trees look a lot more artificial and lifeless, and the extra frame or two isn't worth it in my opinion. Therefore, I recommend putting this on high. Depth of field and motion blur is personal preference mostly. I'd recommend turning both of these off so you can get a proper PC experience, but if you like not being able to see things clearly just because the camera's moving, then go for it. I know some people suffer from motion sickness and motion blur helps with that. I suffer from pretty bad motion sickness in low FPS games like this, but for some reason motion blur actually made it worse in this game. Your mileage may vary, so set it to your tastes. Shadow quality is one where it's almost certainly worth the drop in FPS to keep this on maximum. Every level you go below this will drop your frame rate by about 1 FPS, but setting this below maximum creates this extremely ugly and distracting pop-in effect between shadow and light, which is most prominent in the trees as they move in the breeze. It's most obvious at low and medium, but even at high, it's pretty unsightly. Despite the drop in FPS, I would recommend keeping this on maximum. Lighting quality has very little effect on performance, and for the most part, I couldn't even tell a difference in the visuals. I'm setting it on high because of the lack of noticeable frame rate dips, but I doubt you'll notice any difference wherever you put it, so feel free to put it on low if that's more to your taste. Effects quality doesn't seem to significantly alter how good anything looks, but I have noticed that there is a significant difference in draw distance for effects based on this setting, especially fires from torches. Because enemies sometimes carry torches, being able to see this firelight from further out can make a pretty big difference between whether or not you will spot someone, especially in the dark, so there's a tactical advantage in keeping this on maximum. The difference in draw distance between maximum and low is only about 50 feet, which, especially when you're sprinting on horseback, isn't much of a difference, but in my opinion, it's still worthwhile to keep this turned up. In terms of consistent frame rate, there's almost no difference in the settings, although I did notice that occasionally when the frame rate dips slightly, which could happen for any number of reasons, and I don't mean the horrific stutters when I say this, I'm just talking about it dipping from like 58 to 52 FPS for half a second. When this happens, I've noticed it might dip slightly lower when effects quality is turned to max versus off, but only by about 1 to 3 FPS. And this is so inconsistent that it's hardly worth worrying about in my opinion, but set it to your taste. I'm keeping it on maximum. Volumetric Quality had a slight dip in performance by maybe 1 or 2 FPS, but only sometimes. It was never consistent. I could also never tell much of a difference in visuals with this setting, therefore I'm setting it to medium. Reflection quality and water quality mostly give the water an improved, more realistic look, with reflection quality really improving the atmosphere around the oceans, especially when the sunlight hits them, while water's surface seemed to add this sudsy texture to the water and the waves looked a little bit better, making just the water in general look better. There was literally no difference in performance, so I would recommend setting these to max and high respectively. Shader quality looked about the same to me regardless of what setting I had it at, and I could detect no performance hit with it regardless, so I just put it on high. Global illumination quality has a small impact on the visuals. You can see it looking at my character's cape here. The performance hit was extremely small between low and high, about half a frame from what I could tell, so I'm setting this to high. Now, grass quality is kind of ridiculous. It's the only setting that can't be set below medium, but it has a huge impact on the density of grass and how lush the world looks. This is kind of a hard one to give advice on. Having it on max looks good, but thicker, taller grass in the distance could potentially obscure some things, so there might be a small tactical advantage in putting this on medium. Combine that with the fact that the rest of these settings where I suggest putting them, as you can see on screen right now, on medium I was getting about 56 to 60 FPS, even in areas of the map that show a lot of grass and terrain, while on max I was getting around 54 to 56 FPS. On high instead of max, I was around 55 to 57 and things looked about as good. I'd probably recommend that if you're going to prioritize visuals over frame rate, high is a good middle ground between the two, but personally, I think I'm going to keep this on medium. It definitely looks less good, but this setting has about the biggest performance impact of all of them, and it makes it a little easier to see around, which makes a lot of sense to me. Where do you guys prioritize your settings? All visuals, all performance, or a happy medium between the two? Let me know in the comments below. I hope this video helped you out. If it did, drop it a like and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more Elden Ring content from me in the future. Also, come drop me a follow on my Twitch channel where I play games and run a great Dungeons & Dragons campaign for my viewers. Hope to see you all around. Until next time.